Overnight, something dramatic has happened in the global energy markets, because over the weekend oil prices exploded. And on Monday morning, the Brent crude oil spot price surged around $115 per barrel after trading near $93 just days earlier. And markets reacted instantly to the escalating conflict involving Iran and the USA, and right now there is no clear sign that the tensions will cool down anytime soon. And as Brent crosses the psychological important $100 threshold, another price is rising as well, because Russia's Urals crude oil is also on the rise, and on Monday morning the Urals spot price climbed to roughly $19 per barrel. And for most consumers around the globe, this is terrible news, because higher oil prices mean higher fuel costs, more expensive transportation, and ultimately also a rising inflation. But for one man in the Kremlin, the rally might look like a blessing. Because the Russian Federation is currently facing a massive budget crisis, largely caused by the war in Ukraine and falling energy revenues in the recent years and months. And naturally, many observers are now asking the same question. Could the new oil price rally rescue Vladimir Putin's war economy? And so that is exactly what we are going to analyze today. Hi, my name is Alexander Kortan. I'm a strategic analyst and media manager from Austria, and I'm also the founder of the German YouTube channel Geopol, and today we want to take a closer look about the current oil markets. Because Monday morning began with a shockwave across the global markets, and oil traders woke up to a massive spike in prices. Brent crude oil, which had closed the previous week around $39 per barrel, jumped dramatically when markets opened, briefly trading above $150 per barrel before a slight fall again was visible. And at the same time, Russia's Urals crude followed the rally, reaching around $90 per barrel in spot trading. So on the surface, this looks like a massive win for Moscow and the Russian Federation. Because after all, Russia remains one of the world's largest oil exporters, and oil revenue is still one of the most important pillars of the Russian state budget. And in the last few months, the reality in Russia's economy looks horrific, because the Russian Federation is currently dealing with serious fiscal problems, and regional governments across Russia accumulated a massive budget deficit in recent years. And according to data discussed in the Russian business newspaper Kommersant, regional budgets together ran a deficit of roughly 1.48 trillion rubles, which equals about 19 billion US dollars. And that figure is dramatically higher than the deficit recorded just 1 year earlier. But the situation for the Russian Federation becomes even more alarming when we look at the federal budget itself. Because government documents submitted to the Russian parliament indicate that the federal deficit in 2025 exceeded 5.7 trillion rubles. So in other words, the central government alone is missing tens of billions of dollars. And in the last few weeks, even Russian media outlets are openly discussing the growing financial strain. And we have to be clear, this development is not particularly surprising, because for more than a year we have argued on Geopol that Russia's war economy would eventually run into serious financial limits, because military spendings continue to rise while key revenues are under severe pressure. So to put these words into simple terms, the Kremlin is spending more and is earning less. And that is the main reason behind the imbalance of the Russian state budget. And the most important factor of this collapse has been the collapse of profits in the oil and gas sector. Because Western sanctions, Ukrainian attacks on energy infrastructure, and periods of relatively low global oil prices have severely reduced Russia's income from energy exports. And at times in the past year, Russian crude had to be sold at extremely heavy discounts, occasionally below $30 per barrel. So for the Kremlin, this created a dangerous situation, because the war in Ukraine pushed state spending higher and higher, while energy revenues, traditionally Russia's financial backbone, declined. And the result was the growing budget deficit we just discussed. But now we can see, with oil prices suddenly skyrocketing due to tensions in the Middle East, some analysts believe that the situation might change for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, and if oil stays above $100 per barrel, Russia could simply pump more oil and refill its war chest. And at first glance, that sounds plausible. But to understand why this assumption is misleading, we need to look at how the Russian Federation sells its oil. Because the reality of Russian oil trade has changed dramatically since 2022. And the majority of Russian exports no longer move through traditional vested-insured shipping networks, but instead Moscow relies heavily on a massive fleet of so-called shadow tankers. And these are old ships that operate under foreign flags, use complex ownership structures, and frequently switch off tracking systems, and often perform ship-to-ship transfers in international waters in order to hide the Russian exports. And by 2025, analysts estimate that about 80% of Russia's seaborne oil export relied on the shadow fleet, and the number continues to grow. And so in earlier videos we already discussed how the European Union and Western countries are trying to sanction and disrupt these operations. I will link you the German version of this video in the video description, and if you want to make sure that you cannot miss another update here on the English channel, please to make sure to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, then you're geopolitical always up to date, and for me and my work it's a great support. Thank you all for subscribing. Now back to the video. Because what once looked like a clever workaround for the shadow fleet has now become a serious economic problem for the Kremlin. Because selling oil through the shadow fleet comes at a high price at the moment. Because even though the official spot price for Urals crude might approach $90, that does not mean that the Russian Federation actually receives that amount. Because we can see the real transaction price is often far lower than the spot price, and the reason is simple. Buyers demand massive discounts because of the shadow fleet. And we can see countries like China and India are willing to buy Russian oil, but they know that the trade carries significant risks. Because every tanker sailing under questionable documentation, every ship-to-ship transfer, and every cargo with uncertain insurance coverage creates potential legal and financial liabilities. And so buyers might face sanctions, penalties, confiscated ships, or logistical disruptions. And because they take on that risk, they demand compensation. And in practical terms, this means that buyers push the price down aggressively. But there's another catch that doesn't benefit the Russian Federation, because thanks to the shadow fleets there are additional costs as well. Because financial transactions often have to bypass traditional banking systems, insurance coverage is limited or non-existent, and shipping routes are longer and more complicated due to sanctions and the need to avoid certain ports. And all of this, of course, adds extra costs to the supply chain, and these costs are ultimately deducted from the price Russia receives. And on top of that, there also comes a psychological factor in the negotiations, because any trader of Russian oil knows that Russia urgently needs revenue, and oil exports are one of the few remaining lifelines of the Russian economy. And this, of course, gives buyers strong bargaining power. And the result of that is a massive pricing gap between the spot price and the actual price. So even if Brent or Urals trade above $110, Russia may receive only about $50 to $55 per barrel, and sometimes even less, depending on the complexity of the shipment. And particular risky export hubs such as Novorossiysk, which has been targeted by Ukrainian drone attacks in the past, can push prices even lower because shipping companies demand higher risk premiums. So while the global oil market sees soaring prices, the Kremlin only captures a fraction of that rally. And this is the central paradox of Russia's shadow fleet, because the shadow fleet in the past allowed Moscow to continue exporting oil despite sanctions, but at the moment it also ensures that Russia will never receive full market prices. And this means, of course, that even a global oil rally, Russia cannot magnificently fix its financial problems. And in fact, the situation may become even difficult in the upcoming days. Because what we can see in Europe right now is that Western governments are now increasingly targeting the shadow fleet itself. So in recent weeks, several European countries have begun actively detaining suspicious ships suspected of transporting sanctioned cargo. And one case in particular caused shockwaves across the maritime industry, because authorities in Belgium, with assistance from France, recently detained a tanker linked to Russian oil exports. And after confiscating the tanker, they demanded a security deposit of around 10 million euros before allowing the ship to continue operating. And at the same time, Sweden intercepted another vessel in the Baltic Sea that was believed to be connected to Russia's shadow logistic networks. According to Sweden's authorities, the ship was sailing under a false flag and was suspected of transporting stolen Ukrainian grain to Russia to the city of St. Peterborough. And we have to be crystal clear here. These actions send a powerful signal to shipping companies, because operating inside the shadow fleet is becoming increasingly risky now. And the consequences of that go far beyond the seizure of individual ships, because when one tanker is detained, the entire risk profile of the business increases. So global ship owners must now consider the possibility that their vessels could be confiscated while passing through European waters. And that risk, of course, drives up transportation prices for the Russian Federation. Insurance becomes more expensive if it is available at all. And after that, some companies simply decide that cooperating with the Russian Federation export network is no longer worth the danger. And there's an example from December 2025 that already proves this dynamic. Because after Ukrainian drone attacks damaged a tanker linked to Russian trade in late 2025, the Turkish shipping company Besiktas Shipping, connected to the vessel, announced it would withdraw entirely from Russian operations. So we see one incident was enough to remove multiple ships from Russia's logistical network. And exactly this is where the real strategic effect appears. Because every tanker lost, every company that leaves the market reduces competition within the shadow fleet. And fewer shipping companies in the market mean higher transportation costs for Russia, and higher costs reduce the Kremlin's profit margins. So in conclusion, while rising oil prices may give Moscow a small financial boost, they are nowhere near enough to solve Russia's structural economic problems. At a best-case scenario for Vladimir Putin, the oil rally may buy the Kremlin some time that matters in a war of attrition like the one being currently fought in Ukraine. But the effect is too small that it can fundamentally change the financial reality inside the Russian Federation. So Russia's oil exports remain contained by sanction, logistical risks and the massive discounts demanded by buyers just like India or China. And as long as these factors remain in place, Putin cannot fully benefit from the global energy market. So to put it in simple words, the oil price surge might look dramatic on the charts, but it will not rescue the Russian economy, and it will certainly not become the decisive game for the war on Ukraine. But for now, I want to hear your opinion, of course. How do you evaluate the current oil rally, and do you think the high energy prices that we are seeing right now could still benefit Moscow in the long run? Let me know in the comments, I will enjoy reading them. Otherwise, I will end the video here. If you found this video helpful, then please make sure to like the video and, as I said, subscribe to the channel Geopol Global. And otherwise, thank you for watching. Take care you all. I'll see you in the next one.